Hi, everyone. I'm Gabriela Constantin-Dureci, and I'm happy to be here with you virtually presenting my topic, developing language skills through hip hop. A little bit about myself. I'm currently a first-year PhD student at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, where I study bilingualism and second language acquisition. And so far, this might change in the future, but so far I primarily focus on language ideology and on language variation. And you have my email here at the bottom in case you want to contact me after the presentation with any questions or comments, or if you just want to be in contact with me. Let me make my video a bit smaller and let's start with the presentation. Here, there's an overview of what we're going to look at. So brief introduction, then we're going to talk about language ideology, which is actually very relevant to the topic of developing language skills. I'm going to present a case study, specifically some findings from my master's thesis. And following that, there will be some suggestions for critical pedagogy, which hopefully a lot of you will be able to implement, or at least will be able to consider, keep in mind for the future. So let's begin. So language functions as a social identification tool. What that means is that we establish our social identities through language, through the language practices that we use, how we use language. So this means that there are certain preconceptions or assumptions that are attached to language practices, to the way we use language. So certain language practices are praised and considered superior, while others are considered deficient and they're degraded. And this whole theory pretty much encompasses what we call language ideology. So language ideology, or even language ideologies in the plural, are beliefs about language and language use. So those preconceptions, those assumptions that I mentioned before. And language ideology links linguistic practices to a predetermined social order. What this means is that based on the language practices that we display, the way we use language, so the way we speak, we might belong to a specific social order, social class, a certain group. This varies and it's not always consistent or uniform, but this is what we would consider when we talk about language ideology, that our practices ascribe us to a predetermined social order. And in a nutshell, language ideology grants privileges to some, but not to others. So you're all familiar with standard English, and we usually think of people who are able to use standard English as being more educated. But that's actually something that derives from language ideology, from the fact that we've been told that that is an appropriate way to use language and that is associated with higher intellect, better education. So we need to work on deconstructing these assumptions. This is what we're trying to do today. And the US, I already mentioned this, the predominant language ideology is a standard language ideology, which is a bias towards an abstract, idealized, homogeneous language, which is imposed and maintained by dominant institutions. So here, I want to draw attention to the fact that it's an idealized homogeneous language. So it's expected that everybody speaks it uniformly. And also it's an ideal type of language. It doesn't really exist. It's not palpable. So it's more of an abstract concept that we have. And dominant institutions impose this standard language ideology, especially in the US. And the appropriate form of a language is standardized English. Now let's focus a bit on education. So traditionally, we have this idea of classrooms of school as neutral places for exchange, pedagogical exchange between teacher and learner. And also we consider educational institutions as spaces that allow individuals to access codes of power. So through going to school, through getting an education, you can learn what type of codes, what type of language, what type of tools, resources to use to access this power, to become part of the mainstream discourse. However, the issue is that schools are part of a bigger system, so they actually are very interrelated with language ideology, and with ideologies in general, not just about language. And language ideology informs educational policy, and therefore it impacts educational practices. So what we are exposed to in schools is actually a reflection of this language ideology. And in American education, the two most prevalent ideologies as they pertain to language are the belief in language standardization, so that everybody should speak standardized English as the appropriate way to communicate, and the belief in monolingualism. So the US is a very linguistically diverse place. However, there is this ideology that it should be monolingual, so that bilingualism shouldn't be supported and shouldn't be encouraged. And Silverstein coined this the culture of monoglot standard, so that we are supposed to speak only one language, and that language should be standardized English. Okay, so when schools promote this language standardization, they actually become complicit in perpetuating a system that privileges certain language practices. And this is something that I've hinted at before. And in doing so, schools indirectly favor certain types of students. I'd like to mention this very important study by Flores and Rosa from 2015, where they actually question the legitimacy of standardized linguistic practices as objective sets of linguistic forms. So we have this idea that standardized English is appropriate for academic settings, but what they found is that these practices actually originate in racial linguistic ideologies that discredit the language practices of certain racialized bodies. What this means is that there is a very important intersection between language practices and race. So language and race are interrelated, and this is somewhat new field, racial linguistics, that looks at this intersection. So we are not, the way we speak language reflects things about our racial backgrounds, and it's very important to not consider the two as disconnected, because actually there's a very strong link between them. But enough about language ideology. Hope you got an idea about it. I could talk more, but I think this is enough for now. So let's focus a bit on the case study that I did. So I did an ethnographic study, which meant I went and observed a adult ESL instructor with the pseudonym Genevieve. She picked this name. And I wanted to look at this research question: how do teachers' practices reinforce or challenge dominant language ideologies? So by going into the classroom, into Genevieve's classroom, I wanted to look at the way in which her teaching practices contradict or challenge or actually perpetuate this language ideology that favors certain people, certain language practices, and disfavors others. And for this study, I actually gathered multiple sources and modes of data. So questionnaire, I did observations, an interview with Genevieve, and I looked at teaching artifacts, so the textbook and other teaching materials that she was using. I'm not going to go into depth about this. If you have any questions about this case study, I can even send you a copy. But let's move forward. So I'm actually going to focus on the ways in which Genevieve, in which this instructor that I observed, challenged dominant language ideology, because I think we can all learn from her. So she displayed an openness towards multilingualism. Yes, this was an ESL classroom, so people had various language backgrounds. And keep in mind that when I say multilingualism, I also mean multi-dialecticism. So that means multiple dialects, not just multiple languages, but multiple dialects as well. She allowed students to code switch, and what's more important, she code switched herself. So in that way, she aligned with student practices, and students felt like they were integrated into a community where the teacher wasn't alienated from them, but rather was a part of that community because she adhered to the same practices that they displayed. And she viewed their multilingualism as a resource rather than a deficit. And this is something that is very important to explain to our students, to stress how important their multilingualism is. She also expressed positive attitudes towards language variation in the classroom. So language variation means just having different types of language practices displayed in the classroom. And Genevieve was very good at this. She constantly told students that it was okay to incorporate different types of registers, dialects, etc. And this brings us to the last part of the presentation. I hope it wasn't too bad so far and that you're still with me. So here I have some suggestions for critical pedagogy, basically some ways in which instructors, teachers can help students develop their language skills while also teaching them that it is okay to come into the classroom, into the world even, with different language backgrounds. So here I have some suggestions for you, and the list could go on. So teachers should resist the ideology of monolingualism and monodialecticism. Most of us are exposed to multiple languages and multiple dialects because we live in a very globalized society. So when we turn the classroom into a space where we impose this monolingualism and this monodialecticism, we're actually not helping our students succeed in the outside world. So we should honor students' multilingualism and multidialecticism. As I mentioned before, we should view it as a resource, something that can help them be better equipped for society, for being successful. And through our own practices as teachers, as instructors, we should articulate a clear rupture from this dominant language ideology. Basically, not just talk the talk, but walk the walk. If we encourage students to use their own maybe non-standardized language practices in the classroom, then we should allow ourselves as teachers, we should set the example, we should model for them. And we should create the expectations that we are not expecting linguistic uniformity. So that it is okay that students come into the classroom with these different backgrounds and these different ways of communicating, this different linguistic knowledge. That is okay, and this should be clearly communicated from the start by the instructor. Should also make an explicit effort to incorporate a variety of dialects and language practices in our classes. This has many benefits. So first of all, students will be able to increase their linguistic repertoire, regardless of them using those practices or not in the future. It's good to be exposed to it. So students who are more familiarized with standardized language practices will just be exposed to new standard practices maybe, which will be great for them. And students who come with non-standardized language practices in the classroom will have those language practices validated and will feel like they belong. And as I said, students who are more familiarized with these language practices could even be an expert for their peers. And teachers should push back on the narrative of standardized language as the appropriate norm. And more so, we should engage our students in deconstructing this perspective together. So we should work with them, explaining what standardized language is and asking what their opinion is and how does that make them feel and what do they think about it. This affects them deeply, the way they communicate, their language practices, as I mentioned in the beginning, ascribes them to a social order. So it is important that they take an active part in deconstructing this discourse, and they're not just passively receiving this knowledge from the instructor, but rather actively participate in this deconstruction. So that was it on my side. These are my references. These are the references for the entire case study. So there's a lot more than the ones I mentioned in this presentation. And I just want to thank you. You have my email here at the end again. And thank you so much and hope to see you in person soon. Bye.